Hey guys, welcome to Unmatched Philosophy. Today I am joined with Dr. Lance Bush. Would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. So my name is Lance Bush. I work in philosophy and psychology, and in particular in the psychology of metaethics, where I mostly study what non-philosophers, or people without a bunch of formal training in philosophy, think about metaethical questions, like whether there's an objective moral truth or not. And more broadly, I work in issues in experimental philosophy and moral psychology. So I look at how people think about moral issues, what the origins of moral thinking actually are, and then broader questions about the methods. Like if we're going to ask questions like, how do people that don't study philosophy think about philosophical issues? What sorts of methodological challenges do we face when trying to present questions to them in ways that don't draw too much on like technical terminology and stuff like that, so that people can interpret our questions the way we want them to interpret those questions? So I broadly work on methodological issues and moral issues and metaethics, all that stuff. So yeah, I do all that stuff. I've also got a blog, a YouTube channel, where a big part for me about doing philosophy and psychology is is engaging with the broader public and reaching a wider audience. I think that academia has turned too much inwards, and people in academia spend too much time talking to one another and not enough time looking outwards and engaging with everybody else. That's a big thing for me too.
Okay, well, that sounds great. So I'm glad we're going to be getting into some meta ethics. The first thing that I want to talk about is what are some views that are popular within meta ethics, and what is your view in contrast to those?
So the broad dispute that's probably the most central dispute I'm interested in is the dispute between moral realism and moral anti-realism. There are definitely other topics in metaethics. So there's moral epistemology. How do we acquire knowledge of moral facts? There's questions about the relationship between moral beliefs or judgments and moral motivations. So there's a variety of metaethical questions, but a big one concerns the question: are there objective or stance independent moral facts? So the broad division there is between moral realists, who think that there are stance independent moral facts. So that's a term that has seen increasing usage over the years, that term stance independent. But many people may have heard the term objective before. Some people may have heard the term mind independent before. I think people have shifted towards using this term stance independent because it avoids some of the pitfalls and confusions that may emerge when you use those other terms. So, for instance, the term objective is used in a whole bunch of different ways. And in metaethics, or in contemporary analytic metaethics, like a very narrow area of philosophy, it has specific usages. Even there, it's not always used consistently. But the term objective also has all these colloquial uses and colloquial connotations. So, for instance, sometimes by objective, people mean something like without bias or without a preference for one view over another. That's not really what's meant by it. Sometimes people might mean something like there's some agreed upon standard by which we can measure something. So we might say, oh, well, we have an objective way to measure this because we have the metric system. And that's not really what's meant either. Really, what it comes down to is the notion of when you take a certain sort of claim, something on offer is something that could be true or false. The question comes down to what it is that makes it true. And if you're a moral realist and you think it's that the moral truths are stance independently true, that means that whatever it is that makes them true, and this is kind of open-ended for a realist, they're not made true by our stances, by the attitudes, the preferences of individuals or of cultures. In contrast, one could think that there are moral facts and they are made true by our stances. So that might be kind of similar to how many of us may think about like our food preferences or music preferences, where if I say something like pistachio ice cream is delicious, and you ask me what I mean by that, I might say something like, I'm telling you something about my preferences. I'm telling you I prefer pistachio ice cream. I find it to be delicious. Now, so if I didn't say pistachio ice cream is delicious, and what is it that makes that true? Well, if it's an expression of or a description of my attitudes and preferences, my attitudes and preferences are what make it true. So it's pretty straightforward. And the idea for realists is there are moral facts and they're not made true in that way. They're not made true by our attitudes or preferences, nor are they made true by cultural consensus or some sort of procedure. Like if we all employ like some Rawlsian procedure for thinking about how to construct moral values, that what if we all agree to use the procedure, whatever comes out of that, those are going to be the moral facts. It's nothing like that. It's not constructed by humans. It's not made true by human attitudes or preferences. What it is made true by is open-ended. It could be anything. So that's what realists think. On the other hand, anti-realism is simply the negation of the realist position. So anti-realists just say, we believe there are no stance-independent moral facts. And anti-realists could think there are, as I said, stance-dependent moral facts. And that is going to give you a particular position, but there's also a couple others. So I'll go through the sort of the big three. The big three categories, and there isn't even a great way of always universally having any specific agreed upon labels for these. Metaethics, maybe this is true in other areas of philosophy, really, we haven't settled on definitive, stable terms for labeling all the positions that we have. And so you often have this problem that the terms are unstable. So I apologize for that. I want to flag that instead of just giving you my preferred terms for these things, because if you go do a Google search, you want to follow up and learn more about them, you might find different terminology. Okay, so the first category that I'll cover is non-cognitivism, which this is one of those cases where the terminology has changed. These days, you won't see non-cognitivism so much as you'll see the term expressivism. So non-cognitivism / expressivism. Now, this is one of the three. And here I'm just covering the popular anti-realist views. There are popular realist views, but I'm going to narrow myself just to the anti-realist views, unless you want to ask me about the realist views too.
No, that's okay.
Okay, so the non-cognitive view or expressivist view, I'll try to run with just expressivism. So I streamline the terminology. So expressivists think, hey, when people make moral claims, like if someone says stealing is wrong, the expressivist looks at those claims and they say, hey, those might look like and like structurally, like they're trying to say something true or false. They look like declarative sentences. Like if I say that tree is 30 meters tall, or I say George Washington was the first president of the United States, they have the same sort of sentence structure. They look like an assertion about what's true or what's false. But the expressivists would say of these, they may look that way, but they're not actually that way. They're actually serving another linguistic function, another linguistic role, which is to say something that has no propositional content at all. It can't be true or false. It's instead some other kind of utterance. Now, we already have examples of these in everyday life. People will say things like they'll bump their leg on a table and go, ow. Or they might say, hey, pass the salt. In the first case, that's a kind of exclamation or an emotional expression. And in the second case, you have an imperative. It's an order. Shut the door. Pass me the salt. None of these sorts of utterances are capable, even in principle, of being true or false. It's not like there's a fact of the matter about whether pass the salt is true, and we just don't know what it is. That couldn't be a fact of the matter. That's just the nature of that kind of utterance, that it's an order, it's an imperative. And so expressivists in a variety of forms treat moral claims as being expressions only. There's no propositional content. For those who hold the contrary view, cognitivists, who think moral claims are propositional, that does not mean that they don't think that there's some non-propositional content as well. It's not like if you're a moral realist and you say murder is wrong, that you're not both saying you think it's factually true that it's wrong and that you're expressing an attitude, because clearly your tone can convey your attitude. So it's important to keep in mind, one view holds it's expressive content only, non-propositional content only. The other position doesn't hold it's propositional content only. It's propositional content and probably some expressive content too, as well. So it's expressive only versus expressive and propositional. That's the typical contrast. So the two of the popular views that you'll typically get presented with if you take a course on this would be like an older one called emotivism, and it's sometimes called the boo-hurrah theory. And that's the view that when people make moral claims, they're really just saying like boo murder or yay helping people. And so it might look like they're saying helping people is good, like they're saying something true. They're really just expressing an attitude. And the other one would be some type of prescriptivism. It gets a little more complicated because the most prominent proponent of this, R.M. Hare, includes other features. It's universal prescriptivism, and it's supposed to have some other components. But a very crude version of this would simply be that when someone says something like murder is wrong, they're not saying boo murder, they're saying don't murder. They're issuing an imperative. And again, it couldn't be true or false. What all these views share in common is that there is no objective or stance-independent moral truth, because really all morality is in the business of is expressing some type of attitude, some type of non-propositional content. So that's one way in which there would be no stance-independent moral truths. Really, morality is just about you saying something like boo or yay or don't do that. And so there's just no truth to it. That's one view. Okay, the next view is error theory. So error theory, the most prominent proponent of this is J.L. Mackie in Ethics, Inventing Right and Wrong. I think I got the book right here. Aha, I do. Okay. Boom. There's the book. So what Mackey holds is basically something like this: when people make moral claims, moral realists are right about what's underlying those claims. When people say stuff like murder is wrong, they are attempting to say something that could be true or false, and they are attempting to refer to or describe the stance independent moral facts. They're going out there, when they say murder is wrong, they actually are speaking like realists. But they're wrong. There are no such facts. And so when they make those claims, the claims are failing to refer to the facts. It's very similar to something like, it's like the moral equivalent of atheism. I know a lot of people make that comparison, and I've heard many other people make it, and it's a good comparison. So if someone says, hey, I'm an atheist, they're not saying claims like God exists are just expressing things. No, they are attempting to describe God. It's just that God doesn't exist. So the claim God exists fails to actually refer to something out there in the world, because there isn't such a thing. So error theorists think when people make moral claims, they're trying to describe these stance-independent moral facts, but there are no such stance-independent moral facts. Therefore, when they make those claims, all of those claims are systematically false. So the error theorist says moral claims can be true or false, and they're all false. That's error theory. And then finally, the last category, you'll often see some people call it relativism, some people call it constructivism. I prefer the term stance-dependent anti-realist accounts. And this is because what all of this last category has in common is that they are cognitivistic. Moral claims can be true or false. Some of them probably are true in most of these accounts, but they're not true in a way that stance independent. They're true in a way that stance dependent. And this includes a variety of positions. Maybe the most basic position would be some type of individual subjectivism. And on this view, when someone makes a moral claim like murder is wrong, it can be understood to be expressing, it has an implicit indexical component, kind of like if I say I am Lance, it's true, but if you say I am Lance, it's not true. That word I is functioning, it varies in who it's referring to based on who's using the term. So when I say it, I refer to me. When you say it, you refer to you. And so the statement I am Lance can vary based on who says it. In that case, the word I is making the indexical element of the statement I am Lance explicit, but you could have an implicit use of indexicality. So for instance, if I take a bite of cake and I say, this cake is delicious, I could be implicitly saying, according to me, or I consider this cake to be delicious. And if that's implicit in the remark, and then you ask me, okay, well, when you say the cake is delicious, are you attributing the property of intrinsic deliciousness to the cake? I could say yes. I could be a gastronomic realist. But I might say, oh, no. I'm just telling you I like this cake. Now, no, that's not the same thing as expressing an attitude. It's not going, this cake, yum. I'm telling you something. I'm describing the world. I'm telling you something about my preferences. So if I say I prefer, cheesecake, something like that, if it's true that I prefer cheesecake, the statement is true. It's just, it might be true in a way that's not very interesting to people. I'm just telling you something about my preferences. Other people might say, well, I don't care about your preferences. And it would be the same thing in a moral context. If a person went around and they had really objectionable moral views to you and I, and they said stuff like that they don't care about whether you steal or hurt people, they might just be saying something like, I don't have a dispreference for hurting other people. And the rest of us might say, okay, thanks for telling us. We don't care. Or maybe we do care. Now we got to stop you because we don't share your attitudes on that. So it may or may not have any. It's not like realism where the person's saying what's true, in a way that would be, in many cases, universally applicable. It's not like that. So that's one potential view. Others would be something like cultural relativism, where moral claims are made true or false by the standards of different cultures. And then you would have constructivist positions and relation designating accounts. This is a term that Richard Joyce uses. Richard Joyce references where this term came from. And this would include something like ideal observer theory. So this sort of view might say, hey, look, there are moral facts. The moral facts are made true by stances, but they're made true specifically by the stance of a fully informed and ideally rational being. And that being, like any fully informed and perfectly rational being, would converge on holding the same moral standards. So there actually is only one correct set of moral standards. It's just that they're made true by the standards of this hypothetical being. And so technically it's a type of anti-realism because the moral facts are stance dependent, but there's only one correct set of values. So note, that's not a type of relativism, because relativism treats moral claims as having this indexical element where the truth status of the claim can vary based on which standard it's indexed to. If you're an ideal observer theory, they're not indexed. There's only one correct standard, but it stance dependent. So you see, it makes it really complicated. You can't just say this third category is relativism because it includes positions that don't actually relativize morality. I know I said a lot there, but that last category is a tricky and complicated one that includes a variety of different views. So that gives you a sense of the three categories. So three categories, just to recap, are moral claims are just express non-propositional content. They can't be true or false. It's expressivism. Error theory, moral claims try to describe the objective moral facts, but they fail, so they're all false. Okay, so you have that as your error theory. And then your third and final one, moral claims, they can be true, but they're true in a way where they depend on stances.
Okay, perfect. I'm glad that you went through the whole like moral landscape. So which camp do you say that you would fit in?
So I don't fit into any of those. That's why I'm very careful to lay them all out. I'm sure people that have just heard me say all that would say that's too much. It's there's too much going on there. So what's worth noting about all of these traditional sort of categories is that they all focus on the analysis of moral sentences or moral claims. And so they're very concerned with semantics of what you could say are ordinary moral claims. So an ordinary moral claim would be a sort of prototypical utterance that we would take to be in the domain of morality. So it wouldn't be some statement about like the biology of trees. It wouldn't be a historical statement. There's what we take to be moral statements, stuff like stealing is wrong, or you should help someone if they really need it, or you have an obligation to
wrong.
Yeah. So what did you say?
I say murdering cats is wrong.
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
So people have all their standard categories. One of the weird ones that's really popular right now is it's morally wrong to torture babies just for fun. People seem to be running with that one a lot, probably because it really jumps out at people. But there actually is a reason to add that just for fun, because sometimes when you say, hey, would it be wrong to steal? One of the things that could mire people on that question is we'll say, well, in some cases it might be, and in some cases it might not be. And that's a separate issue. That's an issue more about the context in which a general action takes place, where some broad category of actions might be permissible in some cases and impermissible in other cases. And that has nothing to do with anti-realism or realism or relativism or anything like that. That just has to do with broader categories that, it could be objectively wrong to steal just for fun, but it could be permissible, morally permissible to steal in order to save someone's life. So the fact that something is context specific doesn't mean it's not objectively right or wrong. So sometimes people get mixed up about that. And so people add that just for fun thing to try to rule out people conflating the issue of realism versus anti-realism with contextualism. Anyway, so that's just a caveat or an aside for why people might see examples like that. Okay, so what you'll notice about all of these positions is that they all center on the analysis of these sort of prototypical moral claims like stealing is wrong. And what's strange about them, strange to me, is that they focus on this analysis of sentences as though moral sentences themselves have a meaning, like that, and that it's rigid and shared and uniform, such that we could say the category of moral claims, one of the things that makes them a category is that they have a shared semantics. It's that as a category, they express only non-propositional content, or as a category, they purport to describe these stance-independent moral facts, or as a category, they are in fact indexed to the standards of individuals. So some type of subjectivism is true. They all treat there as being this category of claims, and then those claims, in virtue of being members of that category, share certain semantic characteristics in common. And I simply don't share that assumption. I don't think sentences have inherent meanings. I think that language doesn't work that way. I think that language only obtains its meaning in distinct contexts of usage, and that the meaning of sentences is not determined by the sort of properties of the sentences or some sort of view that externalizes meaning to something other than the intentions of the communicator, the person using the sentence. Rather, I think, on the contrary, that it's not so much that the sentences have a meaning, but that people use sentences to express what they mean. And so the slogan I like to use for this is that words don't mean things, people mean things. Language is a behavior. It's a tool that people use to express what they mean. And given that language is a tool that expresses what people mean, different people could mean different things when they make a claim like stealing is wrong. It could be that when one person says stealing is wrong, that they are just expressing non-propositional content. They're just saying that, stealing boo, or don't steal. And then another person could be a realist and be describing the objective moral facts. And a third person could be a relativist. So from the very outset, there's no fact of the matter, I think, that could be determinately settled about what all moral claims mean, because for me, questions about what people mean when they make moral claims are empirical questions about what they're trying to do. They're going to turn on the psychology of the speakers, and they're potentially variable. What you'll notice about the history of the way in which these positions have been articulated, expressivism, error theory, and the relativist and stance-dependent views, is that in almost every case, the proponents of these views almost never engage in any empirical literature. They didn't do any empirical research, or very, very little if they did. And there's been almost no systematic attempt to empirically study how people actually use moral claims in the real world. So to give one example, one common critique of expressivism is that it can't get around the Frege-Geach problem, which is that, look, when people make moral claims, it looks like you could stick a moral claim like stealing is wrong in a syllogism, like shoplifting is a form of stealing, all forms of stealing are wrong, therefore shoplifting is wrong. That would only make sense if stealing is wrong was a proposition, so this is a real problem for non-cognitivists. But the point I've made about this, quite a few times is, what if we went out and we did a systematic survey of how people use the sentence "stealing is wrong" in actual real-world context? Like, we actually followed people around and recorded what they said. And 99% of the time, when people said stealing is wrong, they were actually issuing an imperative. They were saying, "Don't steal." Now, the Frege-Geach problem is going to look really weird, because what is it an account of? It's not an account of how people are actually using the language in everyday life most of the time. So I think that ultimately these are empirical questions, and we need to turn to the empirical data. And that's what I ended up doing. So my own background is actually more now in psychology than in philosophy. And my takeaway when looking at the empirical research is that I endorse an unusual view here. It's called folk metaethical indeterminacy. I don't think in everyday context, when people make moral claims, that they have any implicit metaethical commitments, nor do I think that they adopt any specific metaethical stance. They're neither realists nor anti-realists. Now, that might sound weird, but the comparison that I make when describing this is, compare this to causal claims. Like if I said, hey, I think it's going to rain tomorrow. When people make causal claims, they're making claims about what's going to happen in the future. Well, there are views in theoretical physics about causality and the events that unfold in the future. There are different views, for instance, how to interpret events at the quantum level. So there's the Copenhagen interpretation, the many worlds interpretation, there's the hidden variable interpretation. So there's a variety of interpretations. So when someone says, I think it's going to rain tomorrow, does this require them to have some commitment to one or the other competing accounts of quantum physics? I don't think so. I think that would be kind of silly. One example that the philosopher Michael Gill uses, just to give you one more example, is mathematical Platonism. So this is a view about the metaphysics of numbers. What is their underlying nature? When someone is just like adding up a tip at a restaurant, they're like, oh, the tip is $7.22. Does that require that person to take a stance on mathematical Platonism or anti-Platonism? Gill says, no, it doesn't seem that way. And so I think very much the same thing about metaethics, that people don't have any particular stance on these at all. And so the consequence of that is that if all of the traditional accounts, your error theory, your expressivism, and your stance-dependent accounts, rely on a semantic thesis about the meaning of moral claims, but all of those semantic theses are false or make no sense because they rely on false presuppositions about how language works, or as a matter of empirical fact, people don't have any determinate commitment about which one of these things they mean, then all of those standard anti-realist views would be mistaken. So I end up, like, my view is that all of those views are fundamentally misguided or mistaken. And so that leaves me sort of on the outside of all the traditional categories, without a label, without a name. I'm just sort of sitting outside there going, I don't know what to call myself, because the whole way in which the positions have been framed and labeled and set up relies on presuppositions that I think are false.
Okay, so just for some clarity, so normally when we think of I'll just use error theory in this case. When we think of moral error theory, it has two claims. One, that when people make moral propositions, they're referring to categorical normative, they're making categorical propositions with categorical normativity invoked in them, and that categorical normativity doesn't exist. And I'm assuming you're saying that you deny the first claim?
Right, exactly.
And so my question is this, I guess. Suppose that a person, instead of them saying that other people or everybody else uses, when they make moral statements, they're speaking about categorical normativity, instead that when they hear moral statements, they understand it as something that is categorically normative, and they deny that. What would you think about that?
So when they hear other people make the claims, or when they make the claims?
No, when they hear somebody else make the claims, they think of the first thought that comes to mind is categorical normativity is being invoked in the proposition, and then they say, well, no, I don't think. I think that's just what morality is. It's something that is categorically normative. And so, like, when they hear everybody else make moral propositions, they think that that's categorically, they're making categorically normative propositions as well. But then they deny all of those because they deny categorical normativity. What would you?
Yeah, I think they would be mistaken about what people mean when they make the claims.
Oh,
So
okay.
yeah, I
Even
don't know what it's almost like error theory, but not really the same thing.
even if it was the case that like they don't really make an assertion concerning what the other people mean, just the way that they understand the thing. Like for example, I could say, when people use the term um genius, it may be the case that they mean like, I don't know, somebody that has a IQ of over 200 or something. But when I think of a genius, I'm just thinking of a person that's smarter than me. And so when somebody says, "Oh, this person's a genius," I think that's wrong because this person I don't think is smarter than me, for example, even though like they might actually have an IQ that is higher than over 200. So basically, when we gate like when you listen to the moral propositions, you might attribute different standards to what is actually being meant, and given the standard, I guess, given the meaning that I'm thinking of when you use a moral proposition, which is that or that I understand it as something that's categorically normative, even though that's not maybe what you mean to be saying, and I deny that. What would you think about that?
Yeah, so I think I would have to say something like conditional on that being how we take the statement, what we take the statement to mean, or how you interpret the statement.
Mm-hmm.
It wouldn't be true that there's anything that to which those statements refer. So again, that's why it would be kind of like an error theory. So if you take so someone else says, "Hey, I think stealing is wrong," and then this person you're talking to says, "Hey, I don't know exactly what they mean, but the way I understand that is that they're trying to describe objective moral facts, or the statement is describing objective moral facts." Uh, there's a few things I could say about that. It's going to really depend on what exactly they mean. So if they think that the statement is describing the objective moral facts, I don't think statements have inherent meanings. And so I might just object on the grounds that I object to their view about language. And so we wouldn't get to the second question, which is like whether or not the sentence actually correctly refers to objective moral facts, because I don't think sentences refer to anything.
Mm-hmm.
So that would be an issue. What I could say though is, well, conditional on them having the correct account of language, then I would disagree with the metaphysical claim, and so I would be sort of conditionally an error theorist. And I don't have a real discomfort with that.
Okay.
That's why I'd ask about whether the person themselves is expressing that claim, because I think people could just tell you what they mean when they make it. So a person could say, "Hey, I'm a realist. When I say murder is wrong, I am trying to describe the objective moral facts. I don't have this externalist view about meaning. I'm not going to tell the person, no, that's not what you mean. You actually mean what the sentence means." No, if they say that's what they mean, I take them at their word. That's what they mean. And in all of those cases, I'm an error theorist about those people's patterns of speech. Like, I don't think that their claims are correctly referring to any particular set of objective moral facts, because I don't think there are any such things.
And it seems not only do you deny, like with respect to anti-realists, do you deny like the semantic claim that you think is underlying their kind of views? It seems that you also deny like the realists' claim that there are objective moral properties. Is that correct?
Yeah. So it's really going to be contingent on what you think the nature of the objective moral facts, or I should run with the term stance independent, what the stance independent moral facts are. There's always a really sort of a cheap way to get stance independent moral facts. And it might be surprising, but I do say this, there are stance independent moral facts that I would say, yeah, those exist. And in that respect, or conditional on using language that way, I'm a moral realist. But this is because you could always sort of stipulate your way to a sort of, to me, I would consider it a kind of Pyrrhic victory. Someone could say something like this: look, by stance independent moral facts, I am referring to descriptive facts about what increases happiness or decreases happiness within a particular population. So let's say there's some sort of analytic naturalist that says moral claims like murder is wrong are analytically equivalent. Like they just mean something like murder decreases well-being. Okay, well, I do think murder decreases well-being. So if that's what you mean by a moral fact, then I do think there's moral facts of that kind. So boom, I guess I'm a moral realist on that view, like by stipulation. But notice that what that amounts to is not a description of the world that differs from my current view about what the world is like. I think the world is exactly the same as this person does. They're just labeling or referring to things in that world a little differently from me. If they want to add on top of that extra metaphysical claims, like, no, I'm saying that there's a special kind of fact that is an extra property or something in addition to the natural facts, then I'm going to have an issue. Because if they're saying there's it's not just the case that there's facts about what increases or decreases well-being. There's a further fact that some of these facts are the moral facts, and that's more than a matter of a merely verbal claim. Then I'm going to have some disagreements. But in many cases, these look to me like they're merely verbal claims. The point, though, is that in that case, I'm perfectly happy to affirm that there are stance-independent moral facts of that kind. But other attempts to describe these stance-independent moral facts invoke additional properties, characteristics, or concepts that I take issue with, and I either think that they couldn't or don't exist, or I think that there's an even deeper problem, which is I'm not sure whether the claims being made are meaningful.
Interesting. Why wouldn't they be meaningful?
It's really going to depend on the specific claim, and that opens up this rabbit hole that could occupy a whole conversation. So you have these specific terms that are popular in the contemporary philosophical discourse that's largely centered on non-naturalist accounts of moral realism. So there's this broad division between something I've alluded to already, which are naturalist accounts of moral realism. Naturalist accounts of moral realism will hold that there are these stance-independent moral facts, and they could be identified either analytically or some other way, synthetically or something, with some set of natural facts. So those could be facts about what increases or decreases well-being, or certain kinds of consequences, or whatever it may be, what does or doesn't promote cooperation. There's a variety of ways of cashing out the naturalist accounts in ways that I don't find conceptually too much of a problem, because they're just identifying these facts with facts I already think that there are. Or maybe I don't think they are, in which case they would be false. But just the issue there is that there's nothing that I think is conceptually suspicious going on that would make me say, these accounts are not even meaningful. They're meaningful. I just think they're either going to be trivial or false. It's specifically the non-naturalist accounts that I really take issue with. And these accounts typically will say, okay, the moral facts, whatever they are, they cannot be construed in natural terms. They are not the sort of thing that we could discover using scientific or conventionally empirical methods. They're not consistent with, like, the properties themselves are not natural properties. They're not properties about well-being or cooperation, things that could be cashed out in purely descriptive terms. So they don't think they're like that. The question is, what do they think they are? Some might hold that the stance-independent moral facts are sui generis. They are this autonomous domain of facts. They don't have to think that necessarily, as far as I know. And they may have a certain kind of ontological status. They're not natural, although some non-naturalists will insist that they're not making heavy-duty metaphysical claims. So that makes saying, okay, they're referring to the special logical status. Some of them, like Parfait, I think Scanlon, wouldn't say that. So it makes categorizing everything difficult. I don't want to get too much into that, though. What I take issue with are notions like, specifically the notion of irreducible normativity and the notion of external reasons. There's sometimes people have used other terms like normative reasons, more broadly construed, or decisive reasons. I think I've seen people use that term before. But I prefer the term external reason. Not any specifically well-defined reason why. So I'm open to changing my mind on what sort of terminology we should use. I don't know what I should start with there, the irreducible normativity or the reasons talk, or what? What do you suggest?
Perhaps you should start with irreducible normativity.
Okay, so yeah. I take there to be descriptive facts, and I think that realists and anti-realists alike will generally agree on this. There's descriptive facts like it is raining, or hydrogen atoms have one proton in their nucleus. Like, there's all sorts of descriptive claims that we can make in the sciences, perhaps in mathematics, perhaps in a variety of other sorts of, like, maybe there's stuff like my name is Lance. I don't know if I call that a scientific fact, but it is a fact. It's true. But it's a descriptive fact. It's not telling anybody, it's not prescribing anything for anybody. It's not telling anybody what they should or shouldn't do. It's not saying anything about what's good or bad. So descriptive facts say what is the case. They don't say anything about what, but in and of themselves, what ought to be the case, or what's good or bad, or right or wrong, or permissible or impermissible. All that language, that's normative language. And so we have descriptive language. And the realists and anti-realists are probably happy to agree, for the most part, on the descriptive talk. The question comes down to, what do we do with all this normative talk? What do we do with shoulds, shouldn'ts, goods, bads? Now, on my view, all of that normative talk can be reduced to or described in purely descriptive terms. In principle, I'm not going to say, if a moral realist says you should do that, and they say I'm a realist and by that I mean something irreducibly normative, that they are saying something that could be reduced to descriptive terms. They can't, by stipulation. They're telling me they're not using the language that way. But that's what I mean, and that's what I think is the best way to make sense of someone saying something like, you should do this. Now, how would I construe when I say you should do this? I would say something like, well, what I mean by should is something, I'm expressing something about my preferences or attitudes. So I mean something like, I would like it if you did this, or I would prefer that you do this. And then that just becomes a descriptive fact about my attitudes. So there's nothing metaphysically or conceptually mysterious or particularly difficult about me having a preference. Like, I prefer the pistachio ice cream. I prefer people not run around stabbing people with knives for fun. Like, to me, these are in the same category conceptually. Sometimes when you say that, people will go, wait, so you're comparing your moral attitudes to your food preferences? And then they might get outraged, or they might get upset about this, because they may think that I'm comparing them in more than just their sort of, they have the same metanormative characteristics. And that's because that's all I'm doing. What I'm not doing is saying these are equally important to me. Like, I care just as much. I only care as much about people not stabbing each other as I do about getting pistachio ice cream instead of some other flavor. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not saying these are equivalent in importance. But people make this mistake a lot. They think when you compare things along one dimension that you're comparing them along other dimensions. And you're not necessarily. And I'm not in this case. So that's one thing. That's one caveat I like to provide, because people can get tripped up over that. So I think all of this normative talk can be reconstrued in purely descriptive terms. But proponents of non-naturalist accounts of realism will typically not think that. They don't think that you could reduce talk of what you should or shouldn't do, or what's good or bad, to descriptive facts. Otherwise, they might end up being some type of naturalist or some type of anti-realist like me. So when they say stuff about what you should or shouldn't do, or what's good or bad, those claims cannot be redescribed in descriptive terms. They are irreducibly normative. That's just what that means. It means they cannot be reduced to something that's non-normative, like something that's descriptive. So you end up having some statement like, you shouldn't do this, or this is good, that is supposed to be, you could say, I could just recycle this phrase, irreducibly normative. I don't know that that's meaningful. I don't know what it would mean to say that you should do something, or that something is good, in a way that can't be reconstrued in descriptive terms. Non-naturalists will say they understand these concepts, that they are meaningful, but what I'm not saying is simply, I don't know what they mean. Maybe, I think they mean, there's a good chance they mean something, but I just don't get it. I haven't thought about it enough. That's not the position that I'm taking on the matter. The position I'm taking on the matter is that when you have I don't want to say conceptually complete, but a conceptually sufficient understanding of what's at stake in these discussions and these issues, I think the best understanding of what's at stake in these issues will result in concluding it's descriptive all the way down, that there is nothing irreducibly normative, and that in virtue of understanding that, one understands that something couldn't be irreducibly normative any more than it could be, we could talk about some other irreducible property that doesn't have content. It's vacuous, it's empty, it's not asserting anything. It couldn't make predictions. It couldn't practically figure into our explanations of anything. It doesn't do any work. It's words. It's just words that lack any sort of content that could make a difference even in principle. So I think it's more that, because I think I understand the topic, I understand that you couldn't have something be irreducibly normative. It's not that I'm making some claim about my ignorance or incredulity where I'm going, I don't get it, so, I guess it doesn't make sense. I am definitely not making an inference from, I don't understand what people are saying, to therefore it's not meaningful. And I could give a million examples of cases where I don't understand. Like, if I go to the mechanic and they start telling me about all the stuff they did to my car, I have no idea what they're talking about. No idea. It might as well be magic to me. I don't assume that mechanics are saying meaningless stuff. Why don't I assume that? Well, I have lots of inductive and abductive reasons for thinking that mechanics know what they're doing, because I take my car in, it's making a funny noise. I take it out, it's not making a funny noise. They did something. So there's sort of practical feedback you could get from the world that lets you know that certain types of discourse are meaningful, even if I don't understand them. This is true of mathematics, engineering, medicine. I don't have to know what people talking about those topics are talking about, and much of it I don't understand, to still be in a very good position to judge that they're definitely saying stuff that's meaningful, at least with an extremely high degree of confidence that they're saying meaningful stuff, because there's external markers that would suggest that they're saying meaningful stuff. When it comes to people talking about irreducibly normative claims, like you just should do this and it's not reducible to a descriptive claim, you don't have those kinds of markers or indicators. There's nothing that would indicate that. There's no external metric that I have access to that would indicate that they're saying something meaningful. So I would need some other set of tools or ways of knowing that what they're saying is meaningful. And I don't think that there are any. I don't think that those are available to myself or to anybody else. So that should hopefully clarify like how I'm looking at this. I'm not making a personal appeal to I don't think that they're I don't understand them, therefore they're not meaningful. And I'm not making a claim about their meaningfulness that turns so much on some sort of private appeal to my own understanding. I guess that's really the same point. So I think I should pause there. Do you have questions or things to interject it with at that point?
Yeah, I just have one question. So when it comes to the meaningfulness of it, the thing that you don't find meaningful is this idea of like reasons that are stance independent. Yes.
Well, that's possibly a somewhat different concept. So there's irreducible normativity, but there's also this talk of people having reasons.
Okay.
And those might be understood to be different concepts. So someone might say that because it's a stance independent moral fact, for instance, that you shouldn't hurt people just for fun, that fact gives you a reason to not hurt people just for fun.
Okay.
And so in that case, you have a fact and the fact is giving a reason. So is the reason something in addition to the fact, or is that just another way of referring to the fact? I guess it could vary, or I would just ask the person who is making these sorts of claims what they mean or what they have in mind. I take them to seem to be something a little separate, that there's these reasons or favoring relations, and those are a separate thing that I think are also probably not meaningful.
Oh, okay. Well, the reason why I was asking is because it seems like it seems like you're first starting off with this claim that I'm assuming, because this is grounded in the empirical literature, you seeing that when people are making various, like when you give them a moral statement, they don't always understand it in terms of like something being stance independent. So first, we don't have the reason. I'm gonna just try to build it up. So first, we don't have like moral realism as being like this commonsensical thing. So we don't. It's not like we just start off with this. It's not clear that everybody just starts off with this intuition that we just have these stance independent facts about what we should or should not do. And then we can kind of move a little bit forward into this kind of thing where now we have moral realists who are suggesting that we do actually have these kinds of reasons. We have reasons to not murder cats, or we have reasons to perhaps give to charity. And depending upon like why those reasons hold, so some people might say because these things matter. It like giving to charity is an important thing and it's good, and it's not good because you desire it or because you prefer it or because it fulfills in your goals. Some people might just say it's good because that's just what it is. And it seems like your thought is, and you can correct me if I'm wrong, it seems like your thought is, well, they go from that to this additional claim that therefore I now have a reason independent of my goals, desires, and so on and so forth, and there is a lack of meaning there, like that you don't think that yes. is clear, right? And so what if it's the case that is it do you think it's the case that even the people that are making those kind of assertions don't know what they mean at all either?
That is what I'm saying. Yes. Mm-hmm. So I'm not saying simply something about the degree to which any particular individuals understand these claims or the terminology that purports to refer to these concepts. I'm saying that there are no actual concepts that this terminology refers to. So when someone says there are stance independent moral facts and these give you an external reason to do something independent of your goal, standards, or values, it's not that I think that could mean something, but I don't know what it means or something like that. I'm saying it literally fails to express anything in the context in which the people making these claims are using them. So, of course, because my view is a language is use view, someone could say something meaningful with that. But in all of those cases, we would have to unpack what they mean. And in this particular case, there is a reliable pattern of usage among non-naturalist realists that are invoking this language that I think their specific use of the language is not meaningful. And I'm saying they don't know what they mean because there isn't anything that they could mean when they're attempting to make the sorts of claims that they're making. So I'm not saying I don't understand it. I'm saying nobody understands it because there isn't anything to understand. An example I could give would be, I often quote like the Jabberwocky. So if someone says, "'Twas brillig in the slithy toves, de gyre and gimble in the wabe," if someone went around saying that, they're like, unless they stipulate something and they explain what they mean, I take that to not be meaningful. That's a bunch of nonsense language. And I think that one of the things that could happen with philosophers is that they can end up creating technical terminology that purports to be meaningful, but that fails to be meaningful. And I think that they can end up tricking themselves into thinking it's meaningful when they mistakenly think, for instance, and this is a case of that, and I'm glad you brought it up, when they take themselves to be sort of piggybacking on or employing commonsensical or ordinary uses of the terminology. So this is something that many realists will say, which is that realist conceptions of morality are the common sense view. They are intuitive, and that everybody gets these concepts. Everybody employs these concepts that if we went out on the street and we found some people, they'd know exactly what these philosophers are talking about when they talk about external reasons. Maybe they don't have the vocabulary, they don't have the terminology, but if you sit down and you talk to them, they go, yeah, I think there's reasons like that. Totally makes sense to me. I'm saying I don't think that's true. I don't think it's true that I don't think they have those concepts. I don't think they use those concepts. And I take whether or not they have those concepts or use those concepts, and I rarely say this, but I take that to be an obviously psychological claim about people. It's an empirical claim. Because if you say this person understands something, understanding, you're invoking a psychological claim about that person. It'd be very similar to if I said most people believe in God, or most people understand what prime numbers are. Those are claims about people's psychology. So no, it's really important to flag this. The people that go around saying people do understand these concepts, or like that they would understand irreducible normativity, or that they are realists, or that they're implicitly committed to realism, they're making empirical claims about what most people think. And in almost no case do they have any empirical evidence, or at least any good empirical evidence, to support those claims. At most, they will often appeal to anecdotes, personal experiences, things that their students have said in their classroom, that sort of thing. That is absolutely horrible evidence about what people mean and how people think. Psychologists are really struggling. We have this replication crisis going on in psychology. It is incredibly difficult to figure out like the basic components of human personality when we have access to literally hundreds of thousands of data points and hundreds, if not thousands, of researchers working on this stuff, pretty much every day for decades. But philosophers think that they could find out even more subtle features of our shared human psychology from talking to students at like Yale or something, as if that's going to generalize to everybody in the world. It makes no sense. These are empirical claims, and you need psychological research, anthropological research. Look, there's over 7,000 languages in the world. They make claims about how people speak and what people mean when they almost exclusively are talking about English. What about the other 6,999 languages? How do they know how people speak in those languages? There's a simple answer to this. They don't know. They might know if they speak 2 or 3 languages, they might know how people speak in 2 or 3 languages. They probably don't, because again, it's an actual empirical question. You don't just go, well, my students say this, I think they mean that, so that's what they mean. It's still an empirical question what they mean. So at best, they have a little bit of anecdotal information about how people speak a few closely related languages with a broad cultural overlap in cognate terms. What they don't have is cross-cultural, richly well-informed data from anthropologists and linguists from around the world for what people mean in even 100 languages, even a dozen languages. They don't even have that. So how are they extrapolating from the 2 or 3 languages they may know at best to the other 7,000 plus languages? It just doesn't make sense. I don't know why they think that. They have to have what I would take to be extremely misguided and ill-informed views about human psychology and the way language works, or something is going on there for them to be making those sorts of inferences. So no, that's the position they're in. The position I'm in is that I ended up pursuing a PhD in psychology, and I specifically ended up studying the psychology of metaethics, and I study how non-philosophers think about these issues. I look at the survey data, I look at how they respond to a variety of questionnaires and other sorts of paradigms that are designed to elicit and probe how they think about meta-ethical questions. Now, I've come away from that literature extremely critical of the literature. I don't think the literature gives us definitive answers, and that's because even when we systematically gather as rigorous of data as we can about how non-philosophers think about these issues, it's still incredibly difficult to figure out what they actually think because there's so many methodological barriers. And again, that's with statistical tools, inferential statistics, all the methods available to us as psychologists. There's work from neuroscientists, work from all sorts of researchers on these topics, qualitative research, quantitative research, at least half a dozen different paradigms now, and we still can't figure it out. But again, philosophers can figure it out by sitting in a chair thinking about it. They're going to figure out human psychology that way. It just doesn't make sense. I'm doing my best to try to address this issue empirically, and I still don't think we've just scratched the surface. So I want to put in sharp contrast my approach to this issue. If you're going to make empirical claims about how people think, you need to take them very seriously, and I'm taking them very seriously. I do not think my critics are taking them seriously enough.
Ooh, okay. So with that being said, I guess I'll have another question. How would you approach a non-naturalist who starts from introspection? So they say, well, I understand what I mean. I don't know if anybody else understands what they mean. I understand what I mean. And then I guess, let me just ask about that case individually. So they just say, I understand what I mean. Do you have like a test or like a way of trying to see if they would understand what they mean, or?
It's really tough. So part of this turns on, and this is some of the stuff that we haven't got into yet, on what they think the nature of the concepts in question are. So one thing to make clear, and often, the typical sort of way a dialogue will go is if someone says, well, I know what I mean, I will ask them, okay, could you explain what you mean? Could you, tell me what you mean? And I've received a few responses. Now, I should flag here, I have not absolutely thoroughly canvassed the whole literature on this topic. This is another case where I barely scratched the surface. So I should say, while I'm confident about my view on the matter, that the terms and concepts that they're employing are not meaningful, I absolutely recognize I could be totally wrong about this. This is a very inchoate position that I'm only beginning to develop now, because I recognize if I'm going to say, hey, your use of those terms isn't meaningful, an appropriate response is, well, what do you mean by meaningful? That's a completely legitimate response. And I don't have a book on like Lance's account of meaningfulness. And so it's a difficult question for me to grapple with. I think on any reasonable construal of meaningfulness that they would agree on reflection that the terms aren't meaningful, but that's really difficult for me to actually show in a dialogue. So I recognize that this is a case where I have an enormous amount of work to do, and I do not expect me saying, hey, I don't think this stuff is meaningful, I think there's a problem here, for people to go, oh, you must be right. Yeah, totally. We're totally out to lunch on this. Absolutely not. For all I know, in the next year or two, I'll come across a really great paper explaining what reasons are, and it'll click, and I'll be like, oh, the problem was me all along. That could totally happen. I'm confident it won't happen, but I've been confident about things before and then turned out to be wrong. So I don't even take confidence to be a reliable indicator of whether I'm right or wrong. So, just like what I want people to do is not think that, well, I'm confident about this, so I got to be right. I want them to take it as a serious possibility that it may be the case that some of the terms and concepts that philosophers employ are not meaningful, that it could be a case, not that they're saying coherent things that turn out to be false, but that there are underlying conceptual confusions that have led them to employing certain vocabulary, idioms, turns of phrase, terminology, technical vocabulary that turns out to be empty of content. I just want that to be on the table. I think we should consider, is that a possibility? And if so, why? And then if that is a possibility, how and why might that emerge? And does it apply to this specific case of people talking about external reasons and irreducible normativity? That's what I want on the table. So anyway, to get back to what ends up happening in these exchanges is I'll ask people what they mean. And sometimes people will give me synonyms. Though, it's like if you ask for, what's a dog? And someone says a canine. What's a cat? A feline. Synonyms don't help me. I'm familiar with the synonyms, and these synonyms, I've made some satirical ways of framing this. Imagine someone comes up to you and they say, look, in this box, I've got a florp. And then you say, okay, well, what's a florp? And they say, well, it's a thing that flirps. And then you say, okay, well, what does it mean to flirp? Well, flirping is what florps do. And you say, okay, but what is a florp? Oh, it's a thing that flirps. And now you have like a sort of two-step, it's not quite a circle, it's like a line that bounces back and forth. What's a florp? A thing that flirps. What's flirping? A thing that florps do. You're not getting anywhere there. It's a terminological merry-go-round that never terminates in anything that you have conceptual access to. Now, if you ask a realist what's an external reason, you often just get that two-step problem. So, I ask what an external reason is, and I'll be told, well, it's a reason is something that counts in favor of performing the action. Okay, counts in favor in what respect? What do they mean by that? Now, one response that realists have given me is, you don't know what counts in favor means? Like, are like with the implicate, like incredulity, like, are you stupid? That's as if I don't have a sense of what that could mean. So I might say, hey, the fact that groceries at this store are half the price of groceries at that store totally counts in favor of shopping at that store. Like, of course I could use the phrase counts in favor. But no, what if you ask me, well, what do you mean by that? Well, it's cheaper. Okay, but why does that matter? Well, I want to spend less money. So you see, it bottoms out in some claim about my desire, some relational fact. I want to buy things that cost less money to save money because I want money so I could buy other stuff. Like there's like a whole explanation I could give you for what's going on here about what I would mean by counting in favor. I understand counting in favor only with respect to counting in favor indexed to or in relation to some standard. The idea of standardless counting in favor sounds like an oxymoron to me. It sounds like an oxymoron, like someone saying a square with no sides. A square just is a thing that has four sides. So if you tell me there are sideless squares, I'm going to say that's nonsense. It's literally nonsense. It's not that there could be, but it's false. It's nonsense. And that's very much how a stance, like an external reason, sounds to me. If it just as an, like, and I don't appeal to this claim a lot because I'm not a rationalist philosopher. I don't think that there are substantive a priori claims. I think all a priori claims are trivial tautologies. But if I were to use that approach, that methodology, I would say it sure seems to me like if there are reasons relate to goals, desires, or stances in some way as a conceptual matter. Like that's just what they are. They just are relational facts about means and relations. Like in other words, I would say reasons are facts about what would be conducive to one's goals or what would achieve one's desires conditional on some set of descriptive facts, something like that, some sort of conditional or relational fact. So I have an understanding. It's just that understanding is a thoroughly anti-realist one. So if they make that move, you don't know what it means, I'm contesting what it means. I want to know what they mean. I have my meaning, they have theirs. I want to know what they mean. So often that move, I think, is rhetorically motivated. It's a means of diminishing the critic and making it seem like the critic is incompetent or confused because they don't understand this terminology that's obviously meaningful. I do think there are obviously meaningful uses of the terminology. I just think those are the anti-realist uses, not the realist uses. So I want to know what they mean. So one thing we'll try to do is not explain by, in a sense, implying you're stupid for asking. So that's one thing they'll do. That's not nice when they do that, but professional philosophers will tend to avoid doing that. So you ask what a reason is, you're told it's counting in favor. What does that mean? I don't think they have a meaningful explanation for what that means. And in fact, Derek Parfit himself admits on page 272 of volume 2 of On What Matters that he's just using this in a synonymous sense. I don't know if you saw me quoting that before.
I did.
Should I get the quote? Would that help us here?
That's perfectly fine. Go for it.
Okay, so just so people can see that it's not just me saying this, it's the realists themselves saying this. So I have the quote. Here's what Parfit says. I could say that when some fact, and note he uses that language I used earlier. He says, I could say that when some fact gives us a reason to act in some way, this fact counts in favor of this act. But this claim adds little since counts in favor of means roughly gives a reason for. Williams suggests that the phrase has a reason does not have any such intelligible, irreducibly normative external sense. So note that Parfit himself acknowledges, at least on his view, these are just synonyms. This isn't getting us anywhere. It's like saying a florp is something that flirps and a thing that flirps is a florp. That's not helping me gain a conceptual entry to understanding the concepts. Now, that does raise another question, which is, how did the realists get conceptual entry to these concepts? What did they? Because if they were just presented with two, like if I presented you with two equally mysterious terms, and I said, look, these mean the same thing. It's not like you're going to go, oh, they mean the same thing. Well, now I know what they collectively mean. It would be equally mysterious. Like, it's not like you could, if I say, hey, here's a box. Do you know what's in the box? And you're like, no, because you haven't opened the box. And I go, okay, well, whatever's in this box, there's an identical copy of it in this box. That doesn't help you know what's in either box. You're just going to go, okay, well, now I don't know what's in either box. That's exactly the problem I stand in when someone says a reason is something that counts in favor. What do they mean by counts in favor? I don't think they have an explanation for this. So you get this two-step problem. Now, sometimes they might say a bit more. They might say, well, something that counts in favor means it would be good for you to do it. If you say, well, what does that mean? Well, it means you should do it. Well, what does it should be? Well, it means that you have a reason to do it. Okay, so now we got a four-step loop. So the problem is that often what you're given, if you ask them to explain what they mean, is they give this circular set of mutually interdefining terms, and it's, you know, as Pete Mandic says about qualia or phenomenal states, it's viciously circular. It never terminates in anything that a person on the outside has any conceptual entry point to grasping. And so what you have, this word means this word means that word means that word. And sometimes people have responded, well, all language is this way. I don't think so. So I'm not going to grant that. So often, if I make these critiques, the response to that will be that this is actually true of all language. And then we have to get into a bunch of complicated questions about concept acquisition, because I don't think language is like that. I don't know if we get, so I'll pause there again because I've said a lot.
I mean, I guess you could just, I don't know if you were finished with your point concerning that they're, like, when realists are attempting to give an explanation as to what reasons are, that it doesn't seem like they actually get anywhere. I don't know if you were finished with that point, were you?
There's more to say on this, so I just don't know if I should keep going.
Go for it.
Okay. All right. So one issue is when they give these circular and mutually interdefining terms. That I think is a very serious problem. The other thing they might try to do is explain the terms by ostension or providing examples. So they might say, okay, well, consider a case like a person setting a cat on fire just for fun. Don't you think, like, they might invite you in considering this case to share in the same concepts that they claim to have. They might say, well, Lance, don't you think that the person that wants to do this has a reason not to do this? And then if I say yes, they'll say, boom, there's your external reason. But if I say, well, yes, the reason they have is that I don't want them to, that's not the same thing. So you may be invited via some examples or thought experiments, or they might point to cases and say, well, in this case, this is a case where you'd have a reason. This to me is no more helpful, because in all of these cases, my understanding of the cases, they're fully explicable in anti-realist terms. At no point in considering these cases do I ever share or seem to myself to share. I don't have like any sort of phenomenology or intuition that you would have a reason independent of your goals or desires. And Derek Parfit and others have sort of given intuition pumps, like the Future Tuesday case, where you have a person that is like, hey, you could, I don't know exactly, I can't remember the case exactly off the top of my head, but it's something like this. Imagine you could have your dental appointment Monday or Tuesday. Monday they have anesthetic, but they'll be all out on Tuesday. It would be excruciatingly, agonizingly painful. Imagine a person just going, yeah, whatever, let's do it Tuesday. They're indifferent to that. That'd be really weird, because it's like the person just doesn't care what happens to themselves on Tuesday. The idea there is that there's something, they're irrational. They have a reason to care about themselves independent of their total lack of desire. And when I've been given that case, I just look at that and go, that doesn't strike me as irrational. I just don't share their intuitions. And that is where realists will sometimes fall back on claims about what's commonsensical or intuitive. So they might say, but that is the intuitive response, like we have, or that a person that understands these concepts or introspects about them would have about them. And so you, Lance, you're the idiosyncratic one. There's something wrong with your way of thinking about things. So that might be one claim. Another claim might be, this is the common sense view that most people have. So if they're making the second claim, that's an empirical claim. Where's their evidence? And the answer is they don't have it. They don't have evidence that would support that most people are realists about these sorts of things. Even if they got most people to say that the person in the Future Tuesday case is irrational, they would need good evidence that the measures they're using to get that to elicit that sort of response are valid measures. In other words, they'd have to show that the people responding to that question interpret it in the same way as they do. Good luck with that. It's really hard to do that. And I do research specifically on how non-philosophers interpret questions about realism, and they routinely interpret them in unintended ways. That's the result of my own data. And that's largely what led me to form the conclusion that most people probably have no determinate views on the matter. So again, there's an empirical issue here. I'm taking the empirical issue seriously. It doesn't seem like they are. So that at least puts us in some degree of epistemic asymmetry that favors me up to a point. Unless I'm wrong about the data, but if they think I'm wrong about the data, then let's talk about that. So that's one issue. If they're making a claim about what philosophers think, one, technically that's also an empirical question, whether philosophers think this way. However, we do have empirical data on what philosophers think. A majority of philosophers, according to the 2020 Phil Paper survey, are moral realists at 62%. However, that has to be qualified. And it has to be qualified by the fact that a little bit more than half of that 62% are actually naturalist realists. So I don't know if they, like, naturalist realists don't typically believe in irreducible normativity. If you look at the number that endorse non-naturalist realism, it's 26.6%. And the number that give an anti-realist response is 26.1%. They're almost tied. It's 0.5% higher. It's not that much higher than anti-realist. So I see the scenario more as a rock, paper, scissors situation between naturalists, non-naturalists, and anti-realists. And non-naturalist realists will often leverage that 62% to say, we have the majority, we win. I don't think so. They have 26.6% on their side because naturalist views are very different from non-naturalist views, which is only marginally higher than the anti-realist rates. So if they want to appeal, but on the other hand, at least most of them would say that the concepts are meaningful. So look, we don't actually have data. Like if you surveyed philosophers, hey, is non-naturalism an intelligible view? I suspect most philosophers would say yes. I'd put the number higher than 90%. So again, we don't have data, but I'm still granting that to non-naturalist realists. I probably do have an unconventional view on the matter, but philosophy is not a popularity contest. It's going to turn on, like, if, like, you could say, okay, well, if most of them are right, that's some evidence that they're right. I actually agree with that. So I do think the fact that most philosophers very likely disagree with me, I think they do, most philosophers would disagree with me, is evidence that I'm mistaken. Okay, but it's not particularly great evidence. And I've laid out in my own work on this on my blog. It's one of my longer blog series. I want to turn it into a paper at some point. I call this the Phil Papers fallacy. And the Phil Papers fallacy is, I think, a mistake of assigning too much evidence to what most philosophers think. There's a number of reasons to be concerned about what proportion of philosophers thinking something serving as strong evidence for that claim being true. And there's a number of reasons why. The underlying rationale behind all of this, though, is this idea of garbage in, garbage out. If the philosophers are sharing methods and the methods are bad, they're going to get bad results as a product of that. And so if you had a whole bunch of people using broken calculators and they're all getting the same answer and all the calculators came from the same factory with the same manufacturer's defect, we could find that out and then go, okay, well, the fact that they all agree with one another isn't a good reason to think that their conclusions that they drew are true. There's an underlying problem here. Now, analytic philosophers, most of the respondents to the survey, are trained on the same methods. They go to the same schools. They read the same books. And so we really have to pivot and turn our attention to, well, are the majority of, like, granted that the majority of philosophers think that these concepts are meaningful, what methods are they using to arrive at these conclusions? Are they good methods? Are the methods reliable? And I think the answer to that is probably no. I have an issue with the methodology of analytic philosophy. And so the real battleground is probably more a meta-philosophical one. I think I've gone very far astray of addressing this original dialogue, though. So you have that issue of being given a circular set of terms that are just viciously circular and don't bottom out in anything. I don't think that that's very effective dialectically. Another thing that they'll do is try to give examples or extension. That I don't think is very effective. They may say these are common sense views. Everybody has these concepts or readily could acquire these concepts. That's an empirical question. They don't have empirical data that that's true. And I think that the best available empirical data suggests that it's probably not true. So I don't think that's going to work for them. And then they have appeals to expertise, like, well, most of us think this, and so you should defer to what the expert consensus on this is. I think it's a little bit of evidence, but I don't think it's dispositive. I don't think it settles the matter. And if it did, think about if we thought most philosophers think something, so everyone else, including the other philosophers, should defer. Does that mean whenever you look at the Phil Paper survey, in any case where 51% or more of philosophers think something, all the other philosophers are obliged to agree? Like, that's ridiculous. Like, of course people can hold minority positions on these issues, and they can hold minority positions when they themselves are part of the field. They're well informed. They have no reason to just totally subordinate their epistemology, outsource it to what the majority thinks. And I hope appeals to majority aren't making that assumption, because that would be deeply misguided if they were. So you have that. So then that, and I could get into more of the reasons for why I don't think we should endorse what most philosophers think. I'll mention a couple. One would be selection effects. So people that are disposed to employ my metaphilosophical approaches, which are deeply critical of the analytic philosophical tradition, are I think, strongly discouraged from going into analytic philosophy. For the same reason, if you're a skeptic about astrology, you're probably not going to join some National Association of Astrologers. Or if you're an atheist, you're probably not going to go to like a theological seminary and try to become a priest. So notably, if you look at what most philosophers on the same survey think about theism, I think it's about 70% are atheists. It's at least a significant majority. But if you look at specialists in philosophy of religion, if you flip it, actually most of them are theists, about 70%. Why? Does that mean that the arguments for theism are so overwhelming and compelling that all the people that go into the study of philosophy of religion and specialize in it become theists? Maybe. There's another simpler explanation: selection effects. In other words, it's not that studying philosophy of religion causes you to be a theist, but that being a theist causes you to study philosophy of religion. Now, I should say, one point against me on the matter of metaethics is if you do the same for specialists in metaethics, the number of realists actually slightly goes up. It goes up from 62% to 65%. So I can't appeal to that as a defense. What I would instead have to appeal to is that, very broadly speaking, I think people that are dispositionally inclined to hold metaphilosophical views like my own are less likely to pursue careers in analytic philosophy. So I'm a pragmatist. If you look at that same survey, you look at the number of pragmatists, I think there's 1,785 respondents. And if I recall, I think 13 of them said that they're in the pragmatist tradition. That number seems way too low to me, but it's very, very low. So I think, and probably most of them don't even endorse the specific views that I do. I don't know of any. I think I know one other Schillerian pragmatist out there. There's probably some that would identify with William James. Anyway, too much in the weeds. Okay, so coming back to it yet again. So those are just a few reasons to question the philosophical expertise behind people making these appeals. That's a whole other can of worms, and I'd be happy to have more of a discussion about that. The last thing that comes up for proponents of these claims is they may say, look, I can't. There's two things. Sorry.
That's okay.
So first, sometimes they'll say, okay, well, if you're asking me what I mean, one issue is that this is that claims like irreducibly normative claims or normative reasons or external reasons, these are primitive concepts. And so if you're telling me, hey, this concept you're asking about, I want you to decompose it into the two or more concepts it's composed of. I like the terminology of atomic concepts. An atomic concept is a sort of basic concept that can't be further broken down into a compound. Like if I said red car, it's composed of the concept of red and the concept of a car. It's a compound concept. It's kind of like compounds in chemistry. So some people have taken me to be asking something like this: hey, this concept you have, an external reason, break this down for me. What concepts does this decompose into? What two or more concepts does it decompose into? And then the response is, this is a primitive concept. It doesn't decompose. It's one concept. So you're asking a ridiculous and impossible question. You're asking me, hey, this one thing that can't be subdivided, please subdivide it for me. I'm not asking them to do that. If they want to say the concept is primitive, that's fine. I'm not asking them how to decompose it into a compound concept or the concepts it decomposes into. What I'm asking them to do is to communicate what the concept means. And I typically take it to be a characteristic of meaningful concepts that their meaning is communicable. Now, that is a really controversial claim, and I don't really have a great argument for why I think that. Well, what I would say is that if you take a pragmatic construal of meaning, meaning would be cashed out in terms of the ability to notice a difference in the world in principle, if not in practice. So if someone says, hey, there's these two competing theories about what the world is like, and I say, okay, well, do they make any different predictions? So would there be any way in principle of saying, hey, this theory would predict this and this other theory would not predict this, so I could observe a difference that would allow me to distinguish them? And someone says no, then I think the difference is probably meaningless. So pragmatism, at the very least, can be used as a method or a tool for resolving empty metaphysical disputes. And in this case, I would apply it to this notion of external reasons and ask what would be the difference if there were or there weren't such reasons. And I think the answer would be there aren't any. And so if we're going with some sort of pragmatic construal of meaning, I do think that these accounts fail the pragmatic construal of meaning. But like, then what would I have to do? Convince everybody not only of pragmatism, but my specific account of pragmatic views of meaning? So then I have to convince people of my entire meta philosophy. Good luck with that. Like, I'm not going to succeed at that. So the question would be, okay, if the external critique isn't going to work because they're not going to get on board with my pragmatism, I'm going to have to start digging into, well, what do they think makes concepts meaningful? How do they think you acquire concepts? Why do they think these concepts are meaningful? So I'm going to have to instead pivot towards internal critiques, and then that's going to be case by case. So I can't do that in real time because it's going to matter. Each person's account is going to potentially be different. So there is that issue. We set aside the primitive issue. So then we get over to, because that's not what I'm asking about. I'm not asking for decomposable concepts. Throw that out. Then we get over to the claim, no, I'm not simply saying that the concepts can't be decomposed in that respect. What I am saying is that the concepts are unanalyzable. They are incommunicable. Like I can't tell you what they mean. I could give you synonyms. I could point to cases that I think the concepts are refer to or fall within the scope of that concept, but I couldn't give you some explanation of the concept that doesn't invoke the concept. There's just not a way for me to do that. It's unanalyzable. That I take, okay, maybe there are concepts that are like that, but I have a lot of questions about this. So, I mean, here are some questions. How do they know the concept is unanalyzable rather than that they've simply failed to analyze it yet? When you think about a concept, how do you distinguish which concepts, when you think about the concept, do you have the phenomenology? Oh, this concept is like, when I think about my concepts, I don't notice how decomposable they are. It's not like if I were looking at like models for a chemistry class and I'm like, this particular, like when you stick the little plastic pieces together and you can see, oh, okay, there's 2 hydrogen atoms, 1 oxygen. So this is H2O, this is a water molecule. You can literally see it's composed of 3 atoms. It's not like when I think about my concepts, I see the chemical composition, or in this case, we could say the conceptual composition to see, this would decompose into 4 parts. We don't have a chemistry of concepts that would allow us to see the parts. So how the heck do they know this particular concept has 1 component and these other concepts have multiple components, or this particular concept is such that its meaning couldn't be communicated non-synonymously, but these other ones can be? How do they know that? And how did they figure that out? And where are the papers explaining how they do this and how they figure this out? Maybe they're out there. I suspect that they're not. I suspect this is people are making these claims, I think, uncritically and dogmatically without thinking about it. They just don't have standards or criteria for this. Even if someone could give you standards or criteria, I very much doubt their colleagues share the same standards or criteria. So something I think funny is going on here, where people are saying, I can't communicate it, but that's not a problem because it has the property of being incommunicable. Okay, maybe it does. How do they know that? So 1, how do they know they're unanalyzable? And 2, people clearly do sometimes, I think, invoke nonsense language, like they say things that have no meaning. So people will say 'twas brilliant the slightly toves, or someone might be conceptually confused. Like, look, we've seen bad philosophy papers where a person's ideas are so jumbled. We don't go, oh, this is false. We go, what the hell is this person talking about? This is just nonsense. It's just they're tripped up over the terminology. People sometimes say nonsense. In those cases, the nonsense could not be analyzed. It's also unanalyzable. You couldn't communicate what they mean because they don't mean anything. So we have, I think we could say, supposing I'm right about that, we have turns of phrase, terms, and terms that could be used in ways that are not meaningful, and turns of phrase that are meaningful, but their meaning is incommunicable. So this isn't the it's further analyzable or not distinction. This is the distinction between meaningful but incommunicable and meaningless but incommunicable. How do we distinguish them? I haven't been given a good answer to this either, and I don't know where to find one. I don't know how they're able to figure out these ones are meaningful and these ones are not. What I'm typically told is, well, I get it. I know what it means. Okay, well, that brings us to another problem. Their claim to know what this stuff means is private. It's inaccessible to me. So in the case of the mechanic that says, well, I know what it means to say you fix a carburetor with this particular thing and then this will happen. If I say, well, how do I know that you know what you're talking about? What I think would be useful for them to do is to say, well, technically, carburetor is a synonym for this other word. They give me some other word. So boom, I know what I'm talking. Like, synonyms are not going to cut it. The way we figure out whether they know what they're talking about is by looking at the fruits of their labor, the products of what they do. If they understand what they're doing, they could fix the car and the car will work. Or they could say why they can't fix it, and then another mechanic would agree. And there's going to be some predictable outcome that can corroborate what they're saying that is external to mere words. There's some public means of evaluating the claim. Same way you find out if someone's good at chess, they could beat you at chess. Same way you find out if someone knows what they're doing when they say that they could build a bridge. They build a bridge, you run a car over it, the car gets over it without the bridge collapsing. In all of these cases, there are external means of corroborating the meaningfulness of the claims. There does not appear to me to be any way in principle, not just in practice, but in principle, of corroborating a bunch of philosophers saying, we all know what we're talking about, we know what we mean. There's no external way of verifying that they know what they mean. Now, maybe they would just say, that's fine, these are a priori claims. They're not a posteriori claims. We're not talking about physical objects in the world. We're talking about certain sorts of metaphysical properties or concepts that aren't cashed out in those terms. So you'd be making a category mistake. You'd be being scientistic to demand that we give you some predictable means of corroborating the claims. Fair enough. Okay. But if I don't have access to those concepts or claims, that puts me in an awkward epistemic position at the very least, which is, do I have good reason to believe that they know what they're talking about? Not that what they're saying is meaningful, but true or false. How do I know whether what they're saying is meaningful? What standards should I use? Should it just be if enough smart people say that they know what they're talking about, then they know what they're talking about? Is that it? Because that seems to be pretty much all they're giving me here. And that seems like a serious problem to me, that their claims ultimately turn on private and inaccessible claims. It's, hey, well, I'm looking in my head and I see the concept in there. I know the concept is meaningful, but I can't tell you what it means. If the idea here is that, like, what standard should we use here? What if it was 10% of philosophers saying this? Is that not enough? If it's 70%, 83%, like, what standards or criteria should I use for thinking I'm the one that's confused and mistaken here, and they're the ones that are right and are thinking about this correctly? Now, if they say there's more of us, that's just not good enough. That's not good enough. At a certain point in time, most philosophers were in the analytic tradition were probably Christian. Would we have said, well, there's more of us, so the Trinity does make sense because there's more of us? That's not a good way to reason about this. You want to hash it out dialectically. And what I'm running up against is an impasse. There's a dialectical impasse, which is they're saying, I can't hash it out because it's unanalyzable. It just has the feature of not hash outable. So it just becomes like a trust me epistemology. It just trusts that I know what I mean. I don't trust that they know what they mean. And I don't trust that it's not like the proponents of these claims have delivered to me a plausible metaphilosophy, a plausible epistemology, a plausible psychology, in any respect that would make me think, okay, well, since they've got their psychology, their epistemology, and their metaphilosophy, those are all in firm footing, and they seem to be grasping this, and I don't. I'm going to think, okay, the problem is me. They don't have any of that. I actually have problems with their metaphilosophy and their views about language and their views about epistemology. I have problems with the views, and I think the mistakes they're making are a product of the problems with those views. And I don't think this about concepts I don't understand in biology or in physics because they could deliver the goods. And so we're standing in a situation here where the sciences can deliver the goods. If I don't understand how they arrive at those conclusions, that's fine. I don't know how they land probes on Mars, but I know they do. But when philosophers reach their conclusions and I don't have access to their concepts, their alleged concepts, how do I know? And I think the answer is I don't, and that I shouldn't believe them unless they could give me a good account of those other things that I mentioned.
Well, that was a lot. But what if, so using the mechanic example, you said that, well, suppose that they couldn't fix the car, but there was another person that came in, was like, and they gave you a reason as to why they couldn't fix the car. There was another mechanic that came in and they were like, oh yeah, I concur. That is a good reason as to why he wouldn't be able to fix the car. And you would say, okay, well, at least it seems that he's sensitive to the Carfax. My question would be is like, what if it's the case that you have a realist and a person that was previously in like an anti-realist, and the realist, they had a conversation about the moral facts, and the anti-realist was then like he converted into a realist and was like, I concur with what he's saying concerning the moral facts. Do you think that would show, at least to some extent, that there was a conversation about something that was meaningful, to which the anti-realist would become a realist?
Absolutely. Yeah. So if you had it, like, I'm a Bayesian about all of this. So every time anybody is a realist, a non-naturalist realist, I take that to be some minimal degree of evidence for non-naturalist realism. So the mere fact that anybody is a non-naturalist realist is some evidence that non-naturalist realism is true. And any claim that it's intelligible is some evidence that it's intelligible. I don't take it to be sufficient to overcome my credence in it not being intelligible and not being true, but it's something. And that would be a case that would be especially persuasive, especially if they previously held views very similar to mine. So if a person went around saying, I agree with Lance is right about this, and then they're like, look, I went and got a PhD in philosophy. I thought about this whole lot. I talked to a bunch of people, and when I came out of it, it clicked with me. I got it. I read some Scanlon stuff. I read some stuff from Parfit, and look, it's hard to wrap your mind around when you come at things from the empiricist philosophical framework. But Lance, your problem is that you're stuck thinking within a sort of a philosophical paradigm that's overly restrictive. Of course, it doesn't make sense from within your paradigm. The problem is your paradigm. And so what ended up happening is I had a conversation. I realized that empiricism is not a viable approach to philosophy, that you're going to need a prioristic approaches that are more substantive, and you're going to need this rational approach to things. You're going to need intuitions in your epistemology that do substantive and heavy lifting. And once I was convinced of that, and then I went back and looked at the issue, boom, it clicked. I totally think that's a possibility. It's absolutely on the table that what's preventing me from grasping the concepts is my like sort of current commitments, my sort of current empiricist philosophical views. Could also be some quirk of my psychology. So those are definitely options on the table. I do have a blog post addressing this, like the claim that I'm conceptually impoverished, and conceptual impoverishment could be, some really bizarre quirk of the way my brain works. That I don't find super plausible, but it's certainly possible. I think the more plausible explanation would be, hey, once you go down a particular philosophical path, it can kind of conceptually close the door towards other sorts of considerations. So that's a possibility. And if people that were like the further down they are in the path, such that they're closer to me, and they end up being a non-naturalist realist, the more evidence that would be to me that I'm the one that's misguided and confused here.
Okay, and I have an additional question. I know this kind of touches upon something that we were talking about earlier, but what if it were the case that there was empirical evidence suggesting that ordinary people really did understand, like, what these moral statements, like that these moral statements are going to be invoking something that's irreducibly normative, and they could like say, for example, you say murdering a cat is wrong, and they say like, oh, that's correct, and it seems like almost everyone, because obviously there's going to be some people that are perhaps not, but almost everyone is consistent in displaying some kind of realist views. And I guess the realist would then have the ability to say that realism would be the default position. How do you think that affects this kind of your view on that kind of conversation?
I think it would matter to me quite a bit. I don't know how much it would matter to other people, but I think that would be some pretty good evidence. I would frame it specifically in terms of most people appear to understand the concepts, because we don't want to just bake into the description that they do understand the concepts. So if you had a bunch of evidence that the vast majority of non-philosophers appeared to speak, think, or act in ways that indicated that they understood what irreducible normativity was, I would take that to be quite strong evidence that I'm some sort of outlier here. That would be especially true if you could identify those people that did not. So if this like 5% of participants reliably don't appear to understand these concepts, and you could identify something that's shared between those people, then that might be some evidence that there's something there might be individual differences in people's psychology. Very much like, take cases where it's now becoming increasingly apparent that some people don't have an internal monologue, like they don't think in words. Some people don't have or have very diminished mental imagery, whereas other people have very vivid mental imagery. So some people, their phenomenology, like they imagine a tree and it's like very detailed. Oh, there's the leaves. And other people are like, what do you mean imagine? Like I can imagine the word tree, but I'm not picturing a tree in my mind. So when you look at human phenomenology, you run the gamut of considerable individual variation. And it could turn out that I have some sort of I forget the terminology for those positions, but I would have some sort of conceptual, like I would have like a normative agnosia. Like it's just for whatever reason, my mind is not able to access these concepts that other people have access to. And if you found, for instance, localized lesions in the brains of people, like you have this correlation where, hey, look, we looked at this 5% of people that don't seem to understand what irreducible normativity is. And of those people, we keep finding like about 70% of them, there is damage to a specific region of the ventromedial prefrontal cortex or something. You get real specific with it. If you had evidence like that, I'd go, I think I got a problem here. So I'm totally open to there being evidence that I'm the problem. This is something that I've joked about before, but if I'm not unserious about it, if someone wants to do an MRI or some other sort of physiological study to study like my brain or brain function, I need to keep the brain in here, so not to remove it. That would be great. I'm totally down for that kind of research. I haven't seen any realists show an interest in that. I have literally had people suggest that I'm brain damaged. And Seriously, I'm not kidding about that. And they made analogies to, they'll say, oh, some people are colorblind. Maybe you have some sort of like moral blind spot. The issue there, though, is, well, that's a possibility. I would hope that they would appreciate that there's a symmetric possibility that they have a phenomenal or an inferential hallucination, that this cuts both ways. It could be I'm making a mistake, but it could be they're making a mistake. And if we want to get empirical about it, let's get serious about that. And I haven't seen anybody do that.
Okay, and before we wrap up this interview, I just wanted to ask a few questions about like some arguments in favor of realism, because I often do see you like talk about your views, but me personally, I haven't really come across like your responses to some of the arguments and stuff. So I just kind of want to hear them now. So, I'm assuming I know that this is a pretty popular argument, the like argument from explanatory indispensability. That is like, um, moral facts seem to be like indispensable to our best explanation of the phenomenon that we see. That is, perhaps convergence, like moral convergence, so people becoming to agree over time with like certain beliefs, or becoming more liberalized over time, instead of like 2,000 years ago there was mass like discrimination, and like there was slavery, there was a lot of harm that was going on. It seems very gratuitous, and then now we've like moved away, at least to some extent, from those practices. And including moral facts appears to be indispensable to some, at least that kind of phenomenon. There's probably some others that we could take into consideration, but what would you think about that?
So there's the question of moral convergence, and there's like an abductive argument that the best explanation for convergence in people's normative moral standards is that they're responsive to the stance-independent moral facts. That's one argument. But were you also talking about Enoch's deliberative indispensability?
No, no.
Okay, so this is specifically about convergence.
Well, it's really just about the need to include moral facts to explain some relevant phenomena. So it doesn't necessarily
Right.
have to
Yeah.
be moral convergence, but it could have been something else. Like for example, if people, like, you know how previously you had people who really tied moral realism with this thought of motivation. And so you would have like, oh, the reason why we're motivated to do good things over bad things was because we needed a moral fact. So really just any kind of phenomenon in which we would think that moral facts would be able to explain. It seems that some people would think that you could not have the same kind of explanation. And I guess in this case of moral convergence, had you not have the moral facts. And I'm just asking, what do you think about that?
Yeah, so this is gonna be a case by case. So in the case of moral convergence, I take that to be like an abductive question, like what's the best explanation
Mm-hmm.
for why people converged on similar moral standards? Um, I mean, you could just immediately invoke a principle of parsimony. I don't want to lean too heavily on that, because someone could always just make the point that parsimony don't multiply entities beyond necessity, but whether or not particular entities are necessary is precisely the issue in dispute. So, you don't want to be too quick with parsimony. But what I would say is, look, okay, so let's suppose we just grant that there has been significant moral convergence. So people have ended up moving towards the same moral standards. I would think that before you say, okay, well, the best explanation for this is to posit a whole category of facts that we otherwise would not be motivated to include in our ontology, we would first look at, can we account for that with the stuff that we all mutually agree on, realists and anti-realists alike, like facts about general patterns in human sociology, psychology, cultural and biological evolution, and so on and so forth. And in that case, I just think the answer is, yeah, we can explain it with the sort of mundane tools available to the social sciences. So an example I like to give is that there has been considerable convergence in people's gastronomic practices. So people eat pizza all over the world. They all love pizza. Everyone all over the world was not eating pizza 500 years ago. People all over the world drink Coca-Cola. They wear jeans. They wear sneakers. They were not wearing jeans or sneakers 500 years ago. So why? So I don't think that we should suppose that fashion realism and gastronomic realism are true, that people are learning that Coca-Cola is objectively the best soft drink or something. I'm not paid by Coca-Cola to say that. That they're learning all this stuff, and then that's what they're responsive to the stance-independent normative facts about food and fashion. Rather, what you see is that what you previously had is a world in which travel was difficult. You didn't have ships. Then you had ships, but it was really dangerous. Now you have planes and trains and boats. It's a lot safer to travel. So you get increased contact. So a little thought experiment you could do is imagine you had two societies. They're on separate sides of a big mountain, and they've been separate for 5,000 years. Those societies, I would think, let me ask you, do you think those societies would be really different from one another if they were separated for 5,000 years?
Yes.
Okay, now suppose there's a big earthquake, the mountain collapses. Fortunately, everybody's fine. It's just the mountain gets flattened out. And now there's just open plains between them and they start interacting. So now we come back 5,000 years later, this time, since the societies, the barrier between them is gone. Do you think those societies would be more similar on average to one another than they were previously, or less similar?
More similar.
I think they would be more similar too, because they're interacting with one another. So when societies start to interact more, they become more similar. Now, why? Well, there's lots of explanations for why that might occur. Sometimes horrible stuff happens, like one society just kills everyone in the other society and takes their territory. So now you come back and it's just the people on the west side of the mountain killed everybody on the east side of the mountain. So now it's just them. So that's one possibility. It could be that there's cultural transfusion and they mix the cultures and they blend and merge. It could be one culture totally says, hey, your culture is way cooler than ours. You got pizza. And they just adopt the other culture. So there's all sorts of stuff that could happen where if people interact, they're more likely to be similar than if they don't interact. So here we have a world where we got planes and boats and cars and trains. People are interacting more. We got the internet. We got phones. Is it surprising if they're more similar? I don't think so. Now we could get into all the questions why, all the anthropological and sociological and historical reasons why. When you get people trading and talking to each other and invading one another and conquering one another's territory and making popular entertainment that spreads around the world on TV, why would they become more similar? But those are all like mundane descriptive facts. And we could account for why people have converged in other areas without positing special normative facts. Why do we need to do so with morality? I think the answer is we don't. We don't need to do so. So I think we're perfectly capable of explaining convergence without appealing to stance-independent moral facts. And I think that this sort of this generalizes to other claims where morale, like stance-independent moral facts, are supposed to be necessary or at least the best explanation for some set of observations. In all of these cases, I think anti-realists can make a very strong case that they could explain the observations just fine. And they do so in a way that has that added advantage of being a simpler explanation in terms of, because it's not positing extra facts. Now, it could be that they end up being worse explanations, but it's going to have to be handled case by case.
And I'll just add this on just because I think that there could be a really close relation here between the arguments. So we're going to take the example between the people coming together. And suppose that once they come together, it seems like before when they were like two separate societies, one society was favoring slavery, and another society favored freedom and liberty. And when they converged and once they came together, instead of their like all of them just agreeing with like slavery, they agreed with liberty, freedom, so on and so forth. And we would think normally that that's making some moral progress, and we see that over the years around societies more generally. How do you think that anti-realists would be able to explain that as well?
Yeah, so in these cases when this sort of thing occurs, I don't know exactly how they might explain it in that case, but I could give an example of how people that have different ways of approaching things could end up adopting one over another for like reasons they could articulate. So to give a really simple case, imagine when the mountain collapsed and the two societies started interacting, they had different ways of doing medicine. One side, they used crystal magic, and the other side, they'd started developing science. And they started interacting, and the people with the crystal magic, they thought it worked, and now they see, oh crap, this doesn't work as well as science at all. Let's use the science. So they discover something, which is that science is a better way of doing medicine. Now you might say, okay, they've discovered facts. And in this case, they discovered descriptive facts. Now, when you have these two societies, one that has slaves and one that doesn't have slaves, supposing that these are both members, these are all humans, and they have similar attitudes. Most of them have some degree of empathy. Most of them can put themselves in another person's shoes. Most of them can recognize, hey, I wouldn't like this done to me. And you take those two groups, and one group is practicing slavery. And I don't know if they experience cognitive dissonance or they somehow don't think about, it would suck if I was in that person's shoes, so I wouldn't want this done to me. They then encounter a society that doesn't have slaves, and they see it's not dysfunctional. They're getting along just fine. And they're like, oh crap, we don't even need to use slaves in our society. We could have a way happier society where everyone is better off without slaves. We were wrong and stupid all along. In that case, I don't think that they would be learning what the stance of independent facts are. They would be learning something about the relation between their practices and their own attitudes, preferences, and values. They're realizing, hey, this actually isn't even in line with what I on reflection, what kind of life I would want to live and what kind of institutions I want to have. I didn't realize that. So one of the things that can happen that can explain why people would move from one normative standard to another is that they discover that the non-moral facts that they thought were in line with their goals, standards, and values are actually not. That's one thing that could be happening. Another thing that could be happening is that they could be successfully convinced that what they're doing, they could be induced to feel guilt or shame or something like that, and that could convince them. And maybe those can work in tandem. In principle, this could work in a way where, you and I would probably think that the inducement of guilt and shame is yielding bad consequences. So it could be the mountain breaks down and there's like a hardcore fundamentalist religious group, and they go to the other group and they start trying to convince everybody over there that like homosexuality is something you should feel deeply, you should regret it and feel shame and guilt. And they might succeed, and then people will go, wow, we've come to recognize how horrible and shameful this is, and we're going to punish it. And that would be a regrettable instance of the inducement of shame and guilt. The point there is that in those cases, in the first case, we would judge that the psychological inducement to change the behavior had a good outcome because we're against it. And in the other case, we would judge that it has a bad outcome because we're not in favor of those rules against like being gay or whatever it would be from this religious group. And so in all these cases, I think that if we're going to say that there's moral convergence, convergence can go in any direction. Convergence alone doesn't necessarily mean that the values in question are true. It simply means that there's some sort of descriptive facts that's prompting people to change their minds in a particular direction. And then we would have to get into the details about, well, why? What's causing that change in direction? And unless you think, in this particular case, that inducement to guilt and shame, whoever happens to succeed at getting other people to feel guilty or ashamed of their actions, that's somehow truth tracking of the moral facts, I don't think that it is. Then it's not going to be an indication that the values are true. It would just be an indication that some cultures can successfully induce other cultures to change their standards in response to certain psychological risks that are shared between people. And when you give them the opportunity, they could succeed at doing it. So it just wouldn't be an indication that realism, the facts in question are like moral facts.
Okay, and the one last argument, which I find very interesting that it's used as commonly as it is, but basically the argument will kind of go like this: you should not torture babies for fun because it's morally wrong. If torturing babies for fun is morally wrong, then there is one moral fact, and given premise one, which is torturing babies is morally wrong for fun, is morally wrong, or it's a moral fact. Since from premise two, then we have one moral fact, and then basically that moral realism. What do you think about that kind of argument?
Yeah, so I would just deny the first premise. So the problem with these sorts of syllogisms is that they, when you compress your position down into a short sentence, you leave unstated certain characterizations of the terms in that sentence. So if someone asks me, do you think it's wrong to torture babies just for fun? I have to be careful with how I respond to that, because it's not clear what they mean. Now, for someone might go, it's not clear what they mean. They're asking if you're against baby torture. No, they're not. If they said, are you against baby torture? Yes, I'm against baby torture. I'm against it. Very easy to answer that question. If they're asking if it's wrong, I have to think, well, is this person a realist? And are they asking me, is it stance independently wrong? So if they say, is it stance independently wrong to torture babies just for fun? My answer to that is also no. But you have to be careful. And that sort of question, that sort of syllogism, it might look like, and this is the problem with syllogisms and formalism and analytic philosophy. If someone goes, look, I'm not even going to ask you a simple question. I'm going to give you a syllogism, and I'm going to ask you which premise you reject if you don't accept the conclusion, or premises if you reject multiple premises. That looks on paper like a very formal, erudite, and really scholarly approach to this sort of question. But I actually think that the logic there is serving a rhetorical function. By burying or hiding the presuppositions from and like excluding them from the syllogism, it actually generates the very ambiguity that a dialectic is supposed to minimize or eliminate in the first place. You're now asking me an ambiguous question. Why is it ambiguous? If someone says, do you think, and even if they say, do you think it stance independently wrong to torture babies just for fun? Think about what my options are. If you say yes to that, we know two things about you. One, we know you're metaethically, you're a realist. Two, we know your normative moral stance on baby torture. It's morally wrong. But if you say no, what do we know about you? Not a whole lot. Here's why. That response is actually two questions in one. It's a kind of loaded question. Is it stance independently wrong to torture babies just for fun? If you say no to that, there's actually three positions you could have towards this. You could think there are no stance independent facts, but it is so you could think there are no stance independent facts, but I do think it's morally wrong in some stance dependent way to torture babies just for fun. And in that case, you would say no to the question. Why? Because you don't think it's stance independently wrong, but you do think it's wrong. So it's be no to the first part, yes to the second part. But you could think yes to the second part, but no to the first part. You could think, I think there's stance independent moral facts. I just don't think it's stance independently wrong to torture babies just for fun. Now, I've never met anyone that thinks that, but that's logically consistent with a no response. And then finally, you could think there are no stance independent moral facts. And even if there were, I don't think even on stance dependent grounds that it's wrong to torture babies just for fun. So then you'd be like an anti-realist and like an evil person. So you basically have the options of anti-realist but not evil, realist but evil, and anti-realist and evil. And your response of no doesn't tell you which one of those a person falls into. And so if someone says no to, if someone says yes, you could go, ooh, okay, they're against baby torture. But if someone says no, if it was randomly one of the three, 2 out of 3 chance, that's an evil person. So when you say no, it's kind of a trick question that there's, if we're just going by randomly putting someone in one of the 3 categories, 2 out of 3, they're evil. That puts a person that wants to say no to that question in a tough spot, because it's lumping you in with the evil realists and with the evil anti-realists. So it's kind of a trick question. And that premise is serving that same rhetorical role. It's a trick premise, and it's not even resolved by adding stance independent. And I even did an empirical test on this. So what I did is I gave the participants in the study one of 3 questions. I actually gave a dialogue where someone says, it's like Alex and Sam talking to each other. And Alex says, hey, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies just for fun? I actually explicitly use that specific example. I had a couple more, but I used that one. They say, do you think it's objectively wrong to torture babies for fun? And then Sam has one of 3 responses. One is, yes, I do think it's objectively wrong. One is, the second is, no, I don't think it's objectively wrong. And the third is, no, I don't think it's objectively wrong, but I do think it's morally wrong. I just don't think anything is objectively right or wrong. But I still find that repugnant, horrible, and awful. It should be against the law. Now, if you ask people to judge Sam in these cases, if they say yes, they're like, Sam's good. If they say no, but I do think it's terrible and awful and blah, 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 they basically see them like the person that says, yeah, okay, that person's fine. Maybe they're a little weird. But the person that just says, no, I don't think it's objectively wrong, people are like, holy crap, this person's a monster. So that person is seen in comparatively more negative terms relative to the other 2 people. And so what you could see there is, even if the realist is like, hey, I'm being explicit here, I'm saying stance independent, I'm not hiding the ball, they are hiding the ball. It's a rhetorical trick. And it's a rhetorical trick because it's bundling the meta-ethical question with the normative question and making it seem like the anti-realist is some despicable monster that's not against baby torture. And so this is a very common thing. I gave it a name. I call it normative entanglement. And so those kinds of questions, I think, are a kind of that kind of argument that you've provided. I think that they serve a rhetorical purpose, and I think the rhetorical purpose they serve is largely to make anti-realists look like despicable monsters that are not as opposed to baby torturers realists. Now, I'm not saying that when realists use these arguments, they're doing this on purpose. It's not like I think that they're like sitting around in basements with cigars going like, ha, 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 how can we make anti-realists look bad? But I think that the sort of effect in practice is to achieve that outcome. And I think that there's a sense in which when you use this rhetorical move over and over, you don't realize it has this rhetorical effect, and you see that it's effective. You're like, wow, this really works. This gets anti-realists to shut up real quick. It must be a good philosophical argument. It's not. It just looks like it is, because there's that illusion that's masking that underlying ambiguity there. So that's a big issue for me. And one of the things I want to say about that is that one of the things that I'm most motivated by in defending moral anti-realism is even before saying I think the anti-realist position is the correct one, I at least want to defend that the anti-realist position has nothing to do with being an evil monster. Being an anti-realist doesn't make you a psychopath or a monster or amoral or anything like that. It just, I think, has very little to do with motivation and behavior, and I think it carries very little practical consequences. And I don't like that it seems to me that many moral realists, when arguing against anti-realism, they might sometimes come out and just say something awful about it, like if you're a relativist, you're evil or whatever. But often it's implied in a way that looks like a legitimate philosophical objection, and I think it's not.
Okay, I was gonna. Can you hear me? You can hear me, right?
Yep.
All right, perfect. I was gonna leave this behind, but I'm just gonna do this now. So I have rapid fire questions to do just before we conclude the interview. Are you ready? It's gonna be very silly questions. It's nothing serious.
Yeah,
Just
that's fine. Yeah, I've done these before, so I think they could be a lot of fun. Let's do it.
all right, cool. So, if you had any superpower, what would it be?
The ability to stop, to save reality like a video game, like you could have save points and then you could reload them. I always thought that power was cool. There actually is a book, I think it's called The Perfect Run. It's a 3-part series where someone has that power. So that's the power. Reload reality like it's a save game.
All right, cool. So, elim- ma- material eliminativism or solipsism?
Oh no, I have to pick one.
Yeah.
I guess I go with the limited materialism, but I don't like either of those.
Okay. I would say, what is your favorite genre of music?
I like progressive metal and rock. So one of my favorite bands right now is listening to them today is Lucid Planet. But I like all the standard stuff people like in this genre, like Tool, also like Porcupine Tree, Riverside, Opeth. So progressive stuff.
Okay. And if you had any movie where you would recommend everybody watch it right now, what would it be?
The first movie that came to mind, I don't think I would I'd necessarily pick it would be Memento, but I think that's because I was reading someone talking about Memento yesterday, so I don't know if that's the answer I go with. I guess I'll just stick with that because I can't think of any better ones in rapid fire mode.
All right, cool. And then I'll ask this one more question. If there was anybody but Lance Bush that you could be, who would it be?
Oh, oh man, nobody's coming to mind immediately. That's a problem. I'm not having anybody come to mind. It has to be a real person, not a fictional person.
It doesn't make a difference to me.
You know what? This is a stupid answer, but I'd want to be some kind of like isekai character. I want to go to some other world and have superpowers. So including that pause power. But in the real world, nobody's immediately coming to mind for some reason.
No philosophers or anything?
I don't think so. Look, I have not. I got my problems, but I like being me. There's probably people I would rather be. People, I want to be somebody that's healthier and wealthier and in a better position in their lives. But I don't know who I would have in mind for that.
Okay. Well, that's a fine answer. All right. Well, thank you so much for helping me with this interview and talking to me about meta ethics. Basically everything, really. You went from talking about whether if moral realism was the default position, all the way until discussing the arguments for moral realism and showing to a lot of people, I hope, why they should probably question those arguments and why they might not actually be true. So thank you once again, Lance Bush.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me here. I do know that in that middle portion, I went off on a lot of stuff. That's stuff that I've had on my chest for a while, and I don't know if I've ever just spat it all out. So it was. I felt like more like that was an exorcism than it was a conversation. So I apologize for that.
No, I'm glad that you got it out here, actually. So thank you very much. All right, that concludes the interview.